They came back broken. Not by swords. Not by arrows. Not by anything a man can defend against with a shield or a spear. They came back broken by something far older. Far deeper. By the simple, devastating act of standing next to something larger than themselves. Look at what they carried. A single cluster of grapes. Cut from the valley of Eshcol. So heavy, so impossibly, grotesquely heavy that two grown men had to thread a wooden pole between their shoulders just to move it through the desert heat. 2 men. Straining for fruit. That image alone should have told the whole story. But no one was looking at the grapes. They were looking at the men who carried them. At the hollow set of their eyes. At the way their mouths opened and closed around words that kept filling them. At the tremor in the hands of soldiers who had survived Egypt, survived the desert, survived everything the wilderness could throw at them. 12 men walked into Canaan 40 days earlier. Hardened. Tested. Chosen specifically, because they were the best their tribes had to offer. 12 men came back. But something had been left behind in the hills of Hebron. Something that could not be carried home on a pole. Their sense of scale. Their sense of self. This is the story of what a single encounter with overwhelming architecture and the ancient language used to describe it can do to the human will. This is the story of how 12 men's report became a psychological contagion that paralyzed a nation for 40 years. This is the story the text has been trying to tell us for 3,000 years. Close your eyes for a moment and try to remember who these men were before they left. They were not soft. They were not naive. They had spent their entire lives in conditions that would break most human beings before breakfast. Born into slavery in Egypt. Raised in the shadow of the most architecturally sophisticated civilization on earth. They had looked up every single day of their childhoods at the pyramids, at the obelisks, at the stone temples of pharaohs that were designed specifically to make human beings feel small. They knew what monumental architecture looked like. They thought they did. Egypt's monuments were built in flat river valleys. Built across open plains where you could see them coming from miles away. Where the geometry was knowable. Where the horizon gave your mind time to prepare itself. Canaan was different. The moment the 12 scouts crossed into the hill country, the moment the flat, familiar terrain of the Sinai gave way to the highland ridges of Judah, everything their eyes had trained them to expect simply stopped working. Numbers 13:28. That is the verse. Read it slowly. The people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. 3 things. Powerful people. Fortified cities. Very large. In English, those words sound like a military assessment. Objective. Measured. Reported. But the Hebrew text underneath those English words tells a different story. The word translated as fortified is batsur. It comes from a root that means to cut. To sever. To make completely inaccessible. Not just defended, severed from approach. These were not walls built for defense in the conventional sense. They were walls built to communicate a fundamental truth about the relationship between those inside and everyone outside. You do not belong here. You cannot reach us. You are not in the same category as us. Now imagine standing at the base of those walls. You have been walking for 40 days through open desert. Your boots, if you have them, are worn through. The soles of your feet have memorized every variation of hot sand and loose gravel the Sinai can offer. Your water supply is carefully rationed. Your body has adapted to the flat, horizontal logic of the wilderness, where survival is about endurance, not elevation. And then you turn a corner in the hill country of Hebron, and the sky disappears. Not behind clouds. Behind stone. These were not small fortifications. The archaeological record of Bronze Age Canaan describes walls of Cyclopean masonry, enormous limestone blocks, some weighing tons, fitted together without mortar in configurations that even modern engineers find remarkable. Built on ridge lines. Built on the edges of cliffs. Built at altitudes where the wind itself becomes a weapon against any approaching force. The vertical lines of those walls did not lead your eye to a top. They led your eye up. And up. Until the glare of the Canaanite sky swallowed them entirely. From below, in the dust, with the sun directly overhead and the walls cutting the light into sharp, merciless shadows, you did not see a city. You saw an argument. An argument you had no answer to. Consider what this moment meant specifically for these particular men. Not for soldiers trained in siege warfare. Not for engineers who had studied fortification design. But for men whose entire military frame of reference was escape. Men whose foundational military experience was the Exodus, the act of leaving Egypt under miraculous circumstances, not conquering it. They had never taken a city. They had never had to. And now they were standing at the base of walls that had been standing since before their grandfathers' grandfathers were born. Walls that had watched armies come and go. Walls that communicated, in the silent language of ancient stone, a single message: we are still here. That message landed somewhere very specific inside the 12 men standing in the dust at the foot of those ridges. It landed in the part of the human psyche that does not respond to reason or courage or faith. It landed in the oldest, deepest, most primitive layer of human consciousness. The layer that was wired, long before civilization, to perform one simple calculation when confronted with something vastly larger than itself. Am I prey? The scouts didn't answer that question with their minds. They answered it with their bodies. With the cold sweat that came without permission. With the suddenly dry mouth. With the involuntary step backward. They would not process what that meant until later. Until they were back in the camp. Until they opened their mouths to give their report. But the answer had already been decided in the shadow of those walls. There is a moment in the life of any human being when the frame through which they see themselves cracks. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't give you time to prepare. One moment you are a person with a defined sense of your own size, your own capability, your own place in the hierarchy of things. And then something, a single image, a single encounter, a single devastating moment of comparison rewrites the calculation entirely. For the 12 scouts, that moment had a specific address: the Valley of Eshcol, the highland territories of Hebron, the ancestral home of the Anakim. Numbers 13:33 is one of the most psychologically complex sentences in the entire Hebrew Bible. Read it carefully. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. 3 clauses, each one more devastating than the last. First, identification. We saw the Nephilim. Second, self-perception. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. Third, projected perception. And we looked the same to them. Most readers move through this sentence too quickly. They absorb the general sense of it. The scouts felt small and move on. But if you stop at the second clause and refuse to move until you have truly heard what it is saying, the entire meaning of the passage shifts. In our own eyes. The Hebrew text is precise here. The phrase is beinainu, literally in our eyes. In our own eyes. The text is not saying the scouts looked at the Anakim and calculated an objective size differential. The text is saying something far more unsettling. The scouts looked at themselves and found themselves diminished. The Anakim didn't shrink them. The walls didn't shrink them. Something internal happened. Something in the act of comparison, something in the specific quality of that particular encounter caused these men to revise their own self-image in real time. This is what ancient Near Eastern scholars point to when they examine this passage. The grasshopper image is not a literal biological descriptor. It is a literary device of extraordinary precision. A device that ancient writers used to communicate total psychological collapse, the complete dissolution of a self-concept in the face of something the mind cannot accommodate. In the ancient world, few images were more vivid for communicating utter fragility, utter smallness, utter inconsequence than the locust or grasshopper. The Hebrew word used here, shagab, appears throughout the wisdom literature of the ancient Near East as a shorthand for precisely this kind of existential miniaturization. The prophet Isaiah would later use the same imagery. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. The comparison was not about height. It was about weight, about significance, about the terrifying experience of looking up at something so vast that your own existence feels, for a shattering moment, entirely optional. And the scouts didn't just feel it privately. They said it out loud. In front of each other. In front of the whole assembly. With the full weight of official testimony behind the words. This is the moment that deserves the most careful attention in the entire passage. Because by the time the scouts stood before the congregation at Kadesh Barnea and delivered those words, we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. The emotion they were describing was no longer personal. It had become political. It had become the official self-assessment of a nation. And once a community hears its own designated experts, the men sent specifically to evaluate reality and report back, describe themselves in the language of insects. Something irreversible happens in the collective psyche. There is a threshold in group psychology beyond which fear stops being a private experience and becomes a shared architecture. A structure that the entire community begins to live inside. Where the walls are made not of stone but of repeated language. Repeated images. Repeated testimony from trusted sources. The 12 scouts built that structure in a single speech. 10 of them did, anyway. 10 of them stood before the assembly and said, "We are grasshoppers." 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, refused. They pushed back. They gave the minority report. They insisted the land was good, that the obstacles were not insurmountable, that the same God who had opened the Red Sea could certainly handle a few fortified cities. But this is the brutal, clinical reality of crowd psychology that the text captures with such uncomfortable precision. The minority report never had a chance. Not because it was wrong, but because it arrived too late. Because the grasshopper image had already been planted. Because terror, once voiced in the language of absolute certainty, functions exactly like a virus in a confined population. It replicates before anyone has the chance to develop immunity. Stop. Before we follow the contagion into the camp, before we watch what happens to the assembly in the long, terrible night that follows, there is a word in Numbers 13:33 that demands our full attention. One word. Nephilim. If you have been following this channel from the beginning, from the Watchers, from the Book of Enoch, from the great flood that swallowed the pre-Adamic world, you already know the weight of that word. The Nephilim were the giants of the antediluvian age. The hybrid offspring of the Watchers and the daughters of men. The monsters of the age before the flood. The reason, according to the book of Genesis and the tradition preserved in 1 Enoch, that the flood came in the first place. They were destroyed, wiped clean from the earth. The deluge was specifically described as a kind of cosmic quarantine, the removal of a biological and spiritual contamination that had made the entire pre-flood world uninhabitable. That was the settled theological history these scouts had grown up with. The Nephilim were gone. Ancient history. Prehistory, even. A horror story from before their grandparents' time, told around fires to explain why the world had been unmade and remade. So why, standing in the highland hills of Hebron, looking at tall men behind high walls, did the scouts reach back across thousands of years of theological history and pull out that specific word? Why not simply say tall men? Why not say warriors of great stature? Why not use any of the other available Hebrew vocabulary for physical size and military threat? Why Nephilim? This is the question that the JPS Torah commentary, particularly the work of Professor Baruch Levine on Numbers, addresses with remarkable directness. And the answer reveals something deeply sophisticated about how fear operates in the human mind, and how language can be weaponized even in ancient documentary literature. Whether the 10 scouts reached for that word consciously or in pure instinct, it doesn't matter. The effect was the same. At least 10 of them did. The word Nephilim was not a descriptive term. It was a detonation device. by invoking that specific word, the most cosmically terrifying word in the entire pre-flood vocabulary, the fearful scouts were not simply reporting what they saw. They were triggering a specific set of associations in the memory of every person who heard their report. They were reaching into the deep, shared archive of ancestral trauma and pulling forward the most destabilizing image available. In the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition, this technique has a name. Scholars, who studied the rhetorical strategies of ancient scribal culture, call it evoking the primal register, the use of mythologically weighted language to bypass rational evaluation and activate instinctive, pre-rational responses in an audience. The 10 scouts were not simply reporting on the sons of Anak. They were connecting the sons of Anak to the most terrifying beings in the entire cosmic memory of their people. They were saying, this is not just a military problem. This is a theological one. This is not just a tall tribe behind high walls. This is the world before the flood, somehow surviving into the present. And the assembly heard it exactly that way. Deuteronomy 1 records Moses' retrospective account of this moment delivered decades later to the second generation, and the language he uses is striking. He describes the community's reaction not as military calculation but as cosmic despair. Not "we cannot win this war, but we cannot enter this world." The distinction matters enormously. A military problem has solutions, tactics, time, preparation, alternative approaches. A cosmic problem has none of those things. When the 10 scouts invoked the Nephilim, they did not simply discourage an army. They redefined the entire nature of the obstacle. They moved the conversation from the realm of strategy into the realm of mythology. And in that realm, the 10th scouts had already written the ending. There is something almost clinical about the precision of what they did. Whether it was conscious or instinctive, whether the scouts deliberately weaponized the word or simply reached for the most vivid image available to communicate the quality of their terror, the effect was identical. They broke the will of a nation with a single noun. That night, Numbers 14:1 begins with 2 words in English that deserve to be read in the silence they create. That night. Not the next morning. Not after deliberation. Not after the cooler heads in the assembly had time to sleep on the minority report from Caleb and Joshua. That night. The text records what happened with the kind of stripped, almost clinical economy that ancient documentary literature uses when it wants you to feel the weight of what it is not saying. All the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. An entire nation. Weeping. In the dark. Not in grief for something lost. In terror of something ahead. In the specific, suffocating despair of people who have been told by the people they trusted most to tell them the truth that the future they were promised is physically impossible. Try to hold that image for a moment. This was not a small community. The census recorded in the preceding chapters of Numbers accounts for over 600,000 men of fighting age. The total community, including women, children, the elderly, was likely somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. And the text says all of them wept aloud. That is not metaphor. That is mass psychological collapse. And then comes the sentence that should send a chill through every person who has ever studied the dynamics of crisis leadership. Numbers 14-4. They said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Back to Egypt. Let that settle. These were people who had watched the Red Sea open, who had eaten bread that fell from the sky, who had stood at the foot of Sinai and heard the report of a voice from the mountain that rewrote the entire covenant between humanity and heaven. And in a single night of collective weeping, they were ready to walk back to the country that had owned them. Back to the brick pits. Back to the overseer's whip. Back to the controlled predictability of servitude. Because, at least in Egypt, they knew their size. At least in Egypt, no one had ever asked them to be larger than they were. This is the insight that the text has been building toward from the opening verses of Numbers 13. And it is, I would argue, the most penetrating observation in the entire passage. The scouts' report did not simply frighten the community. It offered them an escape route from the burden of transformation. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of ancient documentary literature. Slavery prolonged. Multi-generational slavery does something to the human psyche that freedom cannot automatically undo. It calibrates a person's internal sense of scale to a specific dimension. It teaches the body, at a cellular level, what size it is allowed to be, what dreams are permitted, what horizon is appropriate. The Egyptian chapters of the community's story had spent 400 years installing a specific self-concept in these people. You are the size of your chains. The wilderness years, the manna, the water from the rock, the dramatic supernatural interventions had been attempting to uninstall that program, to replace it with something larger. Something commensurate with the promise of Canaan. But the program ran deep. And when the 10 scouts stood before the assembly and said we were like grasshoppers, they were not just describing what they had seen in the hills of Hebron. They were describing what 400 years of Egypt had taught them they were. The walls of the Anakim did not put that image in their minds. Egypt did. The walls simply revealed it. Consider what Caleb and Joshua were actually asking the community to do when they gave their minority report. They were asking people who had been psychologically calibrated to smallness for 4 centuries to suddenly expand their self-concept to a size large enough to walk through those mountain gates and claim the land on the other side. That is not a military ask. That is a psychological revolution. And the community was not ready for it. The weeping of Numbers 14-1 is not the sound of cowardice. It is not the sound of simple military fear. It is the sound of people who have been asked to be larger than their entire history has prepared them to be, and who, in the dark, in the desert, at the edge of the impossible, have chosen the familiar agony of what they know over the terrifying freedom of what they don't. It is deeply, specifically human. And it carries a verdict. Not from an outside judge. Not from a distant authority passing sentence on weaklings. The verdict comes from within the architecture of the story itself. From the internal logic of what the text has been building. The 40 years that follow are not described in the ancient narrative as punishment in the conventional retributive sense. They are described as something more precise. As consequence, as the natural result of a community that chose to remain the size of its fear rather than grow into the size of its calling. Moses and Aaron fall on their faces in Numbers 14-5. Not in prayer. In grief. In the specific grief of leaders who have watched the people they were charged with transforming choose, in one devastating night, to remain exactly who they were. And Caleb and Joshua, the two who refused the grasshopper identity, tear their clothes. Not in defeat. In anguish. There is a difference. Defeat accepts the verdict. Anguish refuses it, even while being unable to change it. Anguish stands at the edge of what could have been and insists, against all evidence, that the door was real. The community spent 40 years in the wilderness, waiting for a generation to die. Not the generation of the Anakim. Not the generation of the Canaanite kings. Their own. The generation that chose the grasshopper had to pass from the earth before the land could be entered. Not because God was cruel, but because the text is, above all else, deeply honest about what transformation actually costs. It costs time. It costs the willingness to let a certain version of yourself die before another version can live. 40 years. In the ancient reckoning, a generation. A full human cycle. The span of time required for a set of memories, a specific emotional inheritance, a particular way of seeing the self to fade naturally from living tissue. The wilderness did not change the land of Canaan. The walls of Hebron were still there. The descendants of Anak were still there. The scale asymmetry that had broken the first generation was still waiting, unchanged, on the other side of the Jordan. What changed was the people. The second generation, the children of the grasshoppers, had no memory of Egypt. They had no 400-year program of calibrated smallness running beneath their conscious mind. They had grown up in the wilderness, yes. They had known poverty and hunger and the particular hardship of a people without a fixed home. But they had never been owned. And that difference, that single, specific absence in their psychological inheritance, was apparently enough. When they crossed the Jordan 40 years later, they crossed it without weeping. They took Jericho. They took Ai. They moved through the highlands of Canaan with the kind of momentum that only comes from people who have not yet been taught what they are not supposed to be able to do. The walls that had seemed to scrape the sky, the Batsur, the inaccessible, the severed, fell. Not because the second generation was physically larger than the first, but because they had not yet learned to see themselves as grasshoppers. The 12 scouts, the 10 who brought the report of terror, are not condemned in the text as traitors or cowards. They are recorded as something more tragic. As capable men. As chosen men. As the best their tribes had to offer, sent to do a specific job, who encountered something that exceeded the carrying capacity of their existing self-concept, and were broken by the encounter. The text does not gloat over this. It records it with the spare, merciless compassion of a document that is more interested in the truth of human experience than in the comfort of its audience. The grasshopper complex did not begin in the hills of Hebron. It began in Egypt. In the brick pits. In the 400 years of systematic psychological reduction that preceded every step of the Exodus journey, the wilderness was not the punishment. The wilderness was the treatment. 40 years of being nobody's property, of eating bread from the sky, of having your survival depend on something other than your own enslavement, of slowly, painfully, one generation at a time, learning to be the size of your actual calling rather than the size of your assigned smallness. It just took longer than anyone hoped. It usually does. So tell me in the comments honestly. When the scouts said they looked like grasshoppers, were they reporting an objective physical reality of the Canaanite fortresses and the sons of Anak? Or were they looking through the broken mirror of 400 years of Egyptian slavery, and seeing not the land, but themselves? Where do you land on that? Because the answer changes everything about what the wilderness years mean. To watch the generation of fear finally fade into the desert sand and witness the moment the children of the grasshoppers step back to the Jordan with iron in their hands and nothing in their history to tell them they cannot cross. Subscribe. The dynamic of this land is about to change, and you will want to see it.
Enter the realm of divine secrets. Welcome to Bible Confidential.